You've sent us down some incredibly interesting rabbit holes here at the Deep Dive, and the latest batch of research you flagged is definitely no exception.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about something that touches so many lives.
Yeah.
How we, as adults, teachers, psychologists, anyone who interacts with kids, evaluate students, especially when a diagnostic label gets thrown into the mix.
Exactly. And today's deep dive is going to be laser focused on that very thing. We're going to try and unpack the real impact these labels, things like, learning disorders, ADHD, intellectual disabilities have on how adults actually see and assess these students.
And what's fantastic is the sheer depth of the material you pointed us to.
Hmm.
We're not just looking at one or two studies here.
No, not at all.
You directed us to this really comprehensive piece of work, a meta-analysis, published in the Educational Psychology Review. I think it was 2023.
That's the one, yeah. And this study, it actually pooled the results from 60 different experiments.
60.
Yeah, involving over 8,000 participants. That's a huge amount of data to work with.
That really is. Give you a much clearer picture, I imagine.
It really does. This kind of large-scale analysis gives us a much more, let's say, reliable picture than any single study probably could. So our mission today really is to get to the heart of this.
Okay.
Do these labels actually change how students are evaluated? And if they do, what makes that influence stronger or, maybe weaker?
And you mentioned there might be some surprises.
Oh, definitely. Get ready, because some of what we found might really make you think.
Okay, so let's get right into it then. The big question, I guess.
Yeah.
What's the overall takeaway? What did this massive collection of studies tell us about the impact of these labels?
Right. Well, the main finding, in a nutshell, is that the meta-analysis uncovered what they called a moderately negative overall label effect.
Okay, moderately negative. What does that mean in plain English?
What that really means for you listening is that, on average, students who have a diagnostic label, they tend to be evaluated more negatively than students who are showing the exact same kinds of challenges, but just don't have that official label attached.
Huh. So, like, if you have two kids struggling with attention in class, the one who has an actual ADHD diagnosis might be seen more negatively than the one who's just, having a hard time focusing that day.
Precisely, yeah. And the researchers were able to put a number on this. They used a statistical measure called Hedges G.
Okay, Hedges G.
And the overall G was negative 0.42. Now, that negative sign is really crucial here. It signals that move towards a more negative evaluation.
Right, negative is bad.
In this context.
Exactly. Think of that negative 0.42 as kind of consistent, moderate nudge downwards in how the student is perceived. And the fact that it shows up across so many different studies, it really highlights that this isn't just some fluke, it's a pattern.
Okay, so a consistent negative trend. But you mentioned earlier there's some, give and take. It's not always the same level of negativity. Absolutely, yes. While that overall trend is definitely there, the strength of this effect isn't the same in every single situation.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets really interesting as we start to explore, what might be behind those differences.
Right, let's dig into some of those nuances then, because one thing that really jumped out from the research you shared was this idea of just the label itself having a powerful effect, even without any other context.
This was, definitely one of the most striking findings. The study looks specifically at what happens when people are given only a diagnostic label.
Nothing else.
Nothing else about the student. No description of their behavior, their schoolwork, their personality, just the label.
And what happened?
In those cases, the negative effect was significantly stronger. The G value shot up to negative 1.26.
Wow. Minus 1.26. That's much bigger than the overall average.
Much bigger, yeah. So just hearing a label like autism spectrum disorder or intellectual disability without knowing anything else about the actual person.
It can create a really strong negative impression just like that.
Exactly. It strongly suggests that a label on its own can trigger these pre-existing negative assumptions or maybe even stereotypes that people might hold about certain conditions.
Like a mental shortcut.
Almost, yeah. Like the label acts as a shortcut, instantly bringing to mind a whole set of negative expectations, often unfairly.
That really screams, for you listening, that just knowing a label tells us almost nothing about the individual student, but it can still plant this really negative seed.
Absolutely. That's a huge takeaway for how we talk about kids, how we share information.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful and honestly a bit unsettling to think about. It really underscores the potential harm in just tossing labels around
Yeah.
without providing real context about the student as a person.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the study also looked at different types of evaluations, right?
Hmm.
Were there specific areas where this negative label effect was like particularly strong?
Yes, they did break that down. They looked at different categories of evaluation, and the negative label effect was most significant in two key areas.
Okay, what were they?
First, academic evaluations. These showed a considerable negative effect, with that G value again, this time Madigal 0.62.
Academic evaluations.
Yeah.
So that's things like expectations for how well they'll do in school.
Exactly. Expectations for future academic success, assessments of their current academic skills, that sort of thing.
Okay, that makes a certain kind of sense, I suppose, though it's still disheartening. If a student has a label suggesting a learning challenge,
Right.
there might be this tendency to automatically lower the bar for what you think they can achieve academically.
Precisely. And the second area where the negative effect was strong was in overall assessments of the child.
Like a general impression.
Yeah, the general impression, a sort of holistic evaluation. This
Mhm.
had a G of medical 0.59. So the label seems to contribute to just a more negative overall perception of the student as a whole person.
Okay, so academic expectations and general impressions definitely take a hit. What about other aspects? Were there any surprises, like areas where the label didn't seem to have such a strong negative pull?
Yeah, there were some interesting nuances there. For example, when they looked at attitudes toward the child,
Attitude
like
left?
how willing someone was to work with the student, or maybe how confident they felt in their own ability to support that student.
Okay.
The effect wasn't negative there. In fact, it actually showed a slight positive trend. The G was 0.21, although I should say this wasn't statistically significant.
Oh, interesting. A positive trend, even if small. That's kind of a silver lining, maybe.
Possibly, yeah.
Like, even if there are lower academic expectations, people might still feel, I don't know, a desire to help or believe they can actually make a difference.
That's definitely one way to interpret it. It suggests that while labels might trigger these negative assumptions about abilities, they don't necessarily kill the willingness to, engage with or support the child.
That's good to hear.
Yeah. And similarly, when evaluators considered the cause of the student's difficulties,
Like why they're struggling.
right, or potential treatment strategies, the negative label effects there were also not statistically significant. The G values were negative 0.23 and negative 0.20, respectively.
So pretty small effects and
Yeah.
not reliable ones.
Exactly. It's possible that when people are really focusing on the reasons behind the challenges or thinking about solutions, the label itself just becomes less dominant in their evaluation.
Interesting. So the label hits harder on judgments about the student's sort of inherent qualities or potential,
Mhm.
but maybe less so on our willingness to help or our ideas about how to fix the problem.
That seems to be what the data suggests, yeah.
Yeah. Now, let's talk about the labels themselves. Did the study find that different categories of diagnostic labels led to different levels of negative effects? Like, does learning disorder hit differently than behavioral disorder?
They did look at that. They grouped them into broad categories like learning disorders, behavioral disorders, and intellectual disabilities.
Yeah.
Now, overall, the differences in the negative label effect between these broad categories weren't actually statistically significant.
Oh, okay. So no big difference there overall.
Not statistically, no. However, they did observe what they called a descriptive trend, meaning just looking at the raw numbers, labels related to intellectual disabilities tended to have the most negative impact,
Okay.
followed by learning disorders, and then behavioral disorders seem to have the least negative impact of those three, relatively speaking.
Gotcha. So while it wasn't a statistically strong enough difference to say it's a definite rule,
Right.
there was this tendency, maybe labels associated with more significant cognitive challenges elicited a stronger negative reaction.
That seems plausible, yeah.
Yeah.
And where they did find statistically significant differences was when they zoomed in a bit more.
How so?
When they looked at more specific subcategories of diagnoses, that's where the picture got a bit more detailed and, frankly, more concerning in some cases.
Okay, let's hear it. What were some of the key findings when they looked at those more specific labels?
Well, they found that the most negative effects, the strongest ones, were linked to combined labels.
Combined, like having more than one.
Exactly. For instance, students who had labels indicating both intellectual and learning disabilities, their G was -0.77. That's a pretty strong negative effect.
-0.77. Yeah, that's high.
Similarly, combined behavioral and emotional disorder labels resulted in a G of negative 0.75, also very negative.
Okay.
And then labels for intellectual disability on its own, G minus 0.51, and learning disability on its own, G minus 0.50, also showed significant negative effects, though not quite as strong as the combined ones.
So it seems like the more complex or maybe the more encompassing the label appears,
hmm
the stronger the negative impression might be. Is that the idea?
That's certainly one implication, yeah. It's possible that these combined labels are seen as pointing to more widespread or, significant difficulties across different areas.
Makes sense.
They also noted that labels just for ADHD or just for behavioral disorders alone, they showed negative trends too, but these weren't statistically significant when they did this more detailed subcategory analysis.
Right. So even if not always hitting that statistical significance bar at the very specific level, the general pattern still kind of points towards a negative influence across many different types of labels.
I think that's a fair summary, yes.
Okay. Now, let's tackle something I think a lot of us might assume, that experts, people with specialized training and experience, would be less likely to fall prey to this kind of label bias.
Ah, yes, the expertise question.
What did this meta-analysis find there? Were the experts any better?
This was actually a rather surprising finding, I think.
Oh,
The meta-analysis found no significant differences in the label effects based on the expertise of the person doing the evaluation.
wait, really? No difference?
None that was statistically significant. They compared various groups. Students versus non-students, teachers versus non-teachers, even general education teachers versus special education teachers.
So even special ed teachers weren't less biased.
According to this analysis, no significant difference. They also compared mental health professionals versus others. Same result.
You're kidding me. So even people who work with these labels day in and day out are potentially just as susceptible to this bias as someone who has, like, no specific training.
That's what this large data set seems to suggest. Negative effects were observed across all these groups. It really seems this bias might be quite deeply ingrained, possibly operating, on an unconscious level for many people.
Wow.
Now, the study authors did add a small caveat. They pointed out that some of the subgroups of experts were relatively small in some of the original studies,
Oh, okay.
which could affect the statistical power, the ability to detect a difference if one truly exists. But still, the overall lack of a significant difference found here is definitely a point to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. It really challenges that idea that just having more knowledge automatically protects you from these kinds of biases.
It really does. It suggests that training alone might not be enough.
That's a real eye-opener. It suggests that even with training, even with experience, we need to be constantly actively aware of how labels might be shaping our perception.
Exactly. Constant vigilance, almost.
Okay, what about other factors? For instance, did the gender of the student being evaluated make any difference in how strong the label effect was?
Interestingly, no. The gender of the student did not significantly change the label effect in this meta-analysis.
Really?
Yeah, the negative impact of the label was similar whether the student described in the study vignette or scenario was a boy or a girl.
Huh. Okay, well, that's at least one less layer of potential bias to worry about in this specific context, I guess.
Right.
Now, we touched on this earlier, but let's circle back to the importance of information. You said just the label alone was really bad.
Mm-hmm. Very negative effect.
How did providing more details alongside the label affect the outcomes?
Right, so as we discussed, just getting the label on its own had that most significant negative impact, that G of negative 1.26.
Yeah.
However, when participants were given more information, maybe through those short written descriptions, the vignettes, or even sometimes by watching videos of the student,
Okay.
the negative label effect tended to become smaller.
Ah, so more info helps buffer the negativity.
It seems to, yeah. Although it's important to note, it often didn't disappear entirely. The negative effect was often still present, just less pronounced.
Okay, so giving a filler picture of the student, beyond just the diagnostic category, can act as a kind of buffer against those negative assumptions that a label might initially trigger.
Exactly. It suggests that while the label might create an initial negative frame, having more comprehensive information allows the evaluators, the teachers, the psychologists to form a more nuanced and hopefully less biased opinion based on the actual characteristics and behaviors they observe or read about.
That really highlights the importance of focusing on the individual student, right? Their
Yeah.
specific strengths, their specific challenges, rather than just relying on the shorthand of a diagnostic label.
Absolutely critical. See the child, not just the label.
Now, here's something you mentioned earlier that sounded potentially encouraging. The study looked at whether the timing of the research the year it was published had any influence. What did they find there?
Yes, this was indeed an interesting and potentially hopeful finding for you listening. The year of publication of the original study did have a significant effect.
And which way did it go?
More recent studies tended to show less negative label effects.
Really? That is hopeful. So it's possible that over time, as we've maybe become more aware, more understanding of these conditions, the negative bias associated with the labels has actually decreased somewhat.
That's the encouraging possibility, yes.
Yep.
They even crunched the numbers on this trend.
Oh, yeah.
They found that the negative effect seemed to decrease by about 0.016 per year in terms of the G value.
Okay, 0.016 per year. That might sound small.
It does sound small, but it adds up. When you look across several decades of research, that accumulates into a noticeable difference.
Yeah, I can see that. So
Yeah.
what might be behind that? Increased awareness? Better training?
It could be a combination of things. Increased public awareness, definitely. More specialized training for professionals over time. Perhaps just a general societal shift towards more inclusive attitudes.
Okay.
However, the researchers also urged a bit of caution here.
Oh, why?
They mentioned that publication bias could also play a role,
Ah, publication bias, meaning...
meaning that, especially in the past, studies showing more dramatic, significant negative results might have been more likely to get published than studies showing smaller or no effects.
I see. So maybe the older studies look worse, partly because only the really negative ones got published back then.
That's a possibility we have to consider, yes. It might slightly inflate the appearance of how much things have improved, although the trend itself seems robust.
Okay, that's an important caveat.
Mm.
But still, even with that possibility, the trend towards a less negative effect in more recent research is definitely a positive sign, wouldn't you say?
I would agree, yes. It suggests things might be moving, however slowly, in the right direction.
Okay.
Yep.
What about other sort of technical aspects of the studies? Like, did it matter whether they compared different groups of students versus looking at the same students under different label conditions?
Interestingly, no. Whether the study used what's called a between subjects design, comparing different groups, one labeled, one not,
Right.
or a within subjects design, where the same participants evaluated both labeled and unlabeled descriptions that didn't significantly change the overall label effect they found.
Huh. Okay. And what about where the study was done? Did it matter if it was in the U.S. versus elsewhere?
Also, no significant difference found there. Whether the study was conducted in the United States or in other parts of the world didn't seem to have a major impact on the overall size of this negative label effect.
So it seems pretty universal, or at least widespread across the places studied.
That seems to be the case based on this meta-analysis.
Okay. And finally, just to wrap up the methodology stuff, you mentioned publication bias again. Did they have a final conclusion on that? How much should we worry about it?
They did explore it using statistical techniques, and their analysis suggested some indications of potential publication bias.
Some indications,
Yep.
but not definitive proof.
Exactly. The findings weren't completely conclusive. So what it means for us, really, is that we need to be just a little cautious when interpreting the exact size of the effects reported, especially in those older studies. There might be a tendency for studies that found a significant negative effect to be slightly overrepresented in the published literature.
Got it. So take the exact numbers with a tiny grain of salt, but the overall pattern is likely real.
Precisely. The pattern of a negative effect seems quite consistent, even if the exact magnitude might be slightly influenced by publication patterns over the years.
Okay, so let's try and really boil this all down for you, our listener. What's the most important thing, the key message to take away from this deep dive into this pretty extensive research?
I think the central message is this. Diagnostic labels can, and apparently do, negatively influence how students are evaluated by adults. It's not just a theoretical concern.
And it affects real things like academic expectations.
Exactly. It affects academic expectations. It affects the overall impression formed of the child. And this tendency, this negative nudge, it appears surprisingly consistent across different types of evaluators,
Even the experts.
even those with professional expertise. Yes, that was a key finding.
And that finding about the power of just presenting the label itself, without any other information, that's a really stark reminder, isn't it, of how these labels can trigger strong and often negative assumptions almost automatically.
Absolutely. It's quite sobering. However, the research also offers, maybe a bit of hope, or at least direction.
Okay.
Providing more detailed, individualized information about the student can help to lessen that negative impact. It doesn't erase it maybe, but it mitigates it.
Right, context matters.
Context matters hugely. And that other hopeful sign, the trend of the negative effect weakening, albeit slowly over time, that suggests that maybe, just maybe, positive changes in awareness or professional practices are having some effect.
So this really leads to a crucial question for you, listening at home or wherever you are. Given these findings, what does this mean for how we talk about students? Students with learning differences, behavioral differences, both in our schools and, frankly, in our homes.
Yeah. How can we make sure we're providing the necessary information, the support they need, without unintentionally triggering these negative biases that this research shows are quite real?
It really calls on all of us, doesn't it, to take a moment, reflect, and consider our own potential biases. How might these labels be subtly shaping our own perceptions, even when we have the best intentions?
It's something we all probably need to be more mindful of. Even unintentionally, these effects can happen.
Absolutely. And for those of you who are really interested and want to dive even deeper into the specifics, the statistical details, the nuances between particular diagnostic labels,
We'd highly recommend checking out the original meta-analysis itself. It was in the Educational Psychology Review, published in 2023. Lots more detail there.
definitely worth a look if this topic sparked your interest.
Ultimately, I think this research really underscores the continuing need for us to learn more about this issue and, importantly, to develop effective strategies, effective ways to minimize the potential negative consequences of labeling.
While still doing what's necessary.
Exactly, while still ensuring that students receive the appropriate identification and the support they genuinely need to thrive. It's a tricky balance.
It really is. Well, thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive today. We really hope it's giving you some valuable insights and maybe some things to think about.
Hope so too.
Until our next exploration.